In October 1939, just weeks after the start of World War II, the German submarine known as U-47 moved silently through the cold waters of the North Sea. It was a small vessel, but its mission was incredibly bold. The commander had been ordered to do the unthinkable: break into the most heavily guarded naval base in the world. This base was Scapa Flow, located in the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. It served as the main home for the British Royal Navy. For years, the British believed these waters were impossible to enter. Sunken ships, heavy chains, and fast-moving currents blocked the narrow channels. Patrol boats and underwater detection systems watched for any sign of an intruder. The British felt safe behind these natural and man-made walls. Inside the harbor, some of the most powerful warships in history sat at anchor. For the German Navy, reaching these ships would be a massive challenge. If U-47 could find a way through the narrow gaps, it would be standing right in the heart of enemy power. The crew knew that one small mistake would lead to certain discovery. The moon was hidden and the tide was rising as the submarine approached the eastern entrance. Every man on board was silent, waiting to see if their gamble would pay off. But the mission makes more sense once we understand the world it sailed into. So let's step back to the moment this boat was built. To understand the story of U-47, we have to look at the time when Germany began rebuilding its navy. Following the First World War, there were strict international rules that prevented Germany from owning or building submarines. However, by the mid-1930s, new political agreements allowed them to start construction again. They wanted a boat that was balanced, something fast enough to travel the ocean, but small enough to be difficult for the enemy to find. The result was the Type 7B submarine. The U-47 was one of the first of this specific design. It was built at a shipyard in the city of Kiel and was officially put into service in late 1938, just months before the start of the Second World War. At roughly 218 feet long, it was about the length of two large passenger airplanes parked end to end. Its hull was made of thick steel, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. For power, the boat used two different systems. When it was sailing on the surface, it relied on two large diesel engines. These engines were powerful and could push the boat at a speed of about 20 miles per hour. This allowed the boat to cover thousands of miles to reach its patrol areas. However, these engines required a constant supply of air. When the boat needed to hide beneath the waves, the crew shut down the diesels and switched to electric motors. These motors were powered by massive sets of batteries. While the electric motors were much quieter, they were also slower and could only run for a few hours before the batteries ran dry. The submarine was designed to be a hunter. Its primary weapons were 14 underwater explosive missiles called torpedoes. These were launched from 5 different tubes, 4 located in the front of the boat and 1 in the back. Each torpedo carried a heavy explosive charge designed to blow a hole in the side of a ship below the waterline. If the submarine was on the surface and the sea was calm, the crew could also use a large cannon mounted on the front deck. This was used to save expensive torpedoes when attacking smaller targets. Life inside this steel machine was incredibly difficult. Around 45 men were crowded into a space no larger than a small house. Every inch of the interior was packed with pipes, valves, and heavy machinery. There were no private rooms, and the men often had to share beds in shifts. Because the boat was often sealed tight, the air would quickly become foul with the smell of oil, sweat, and rotting food. It was a high-pressure environment that required a very specific type of leader to manage. The boat's design was only half the story. To turn this machine into a famous weapon, it needed a leader who was both daring and disciplined. Next, we meet the commander, who had to make it work under pressure. The man chosen to lead U-47 was Gunter Prien. To understand the success of this boat, one must understand the man on the bridge. Prien did not begin his career in the military. As a young man, he worked on merchant ships that carried goods across the world's oceans. This early experience was vital. It taught him how to read the weather, how to navigate by the stars, and how ships behaved in heavy storms. When the global economy struggled and merchant work became scarce, he turned toward the Navy. Prien was an excellent student of naval warfare. He was part of a new generation of officers who believed that the submarine was the future of sea combat. He was chosen to command U-47 from the day it was first put into the water. Under his leadership, the crew became a highly disciplined unit. Prien was known for being a very demanding officer. He pushed his men to practice their drills over and over until they could perform them in total darkness. He believed that in the heat of battle, there was no room for hesitation or mistakes. Despite his strict nature, his men respected him deeply. He was not a man who stayed in a comfortable office. He lived in the same damp, narrow quarters as the rest of the crew. He breathed the same foul air and ate the same canned food. This shared hardship created a sense of loyalty that was essential for the dangerous missions ahead. He was often seen on the tower of the boat wearing his signature white officer's cap, looking out over the horizon for any sign of a target. He was also a man of symbols. Engelbert Endras had a drawing of a snorting bull painted on the side of the submarine's tower. This image represented his aggressive style of fighting. He did not want to wait for the enemy to find him. He wanted to go out and find them. He was a master of using the darkness to his advantage, often attacking on the surface at night, where the submarine was harder to see, but could move at its fastest speed. By the time the war officially began, Prien and his crew were ready. They had spent months perfecting their skills in the Baltic Sea. They were about to take those skills into the open ocean for the first time. The commander and his boat were now a single, functional weapon. With their training complete, they were ready to leave the safety of the port and face the reality of war. The war for U-47 actually began before the first shots were officially fired. In August 1939, the boat left its home port in Germany and headed out into the Atlantic Ocean. The crew was on high alert, waiting for the news that would change their lives forever. When the radio message arrived on September 1st, they knew they were no longer in training. They were now hunters in a global conflict. Just 4 days later, on September 5th, the boat found its first target. It was a British merchant ship named the Bosnia. Following the rules of the sea at that time, Prien surfaced his submarine and fired a warning shot from his deck cannon. This was meant to tell the merchant ship to stop so the sailors could escape in lifeboats. Once the crew was clear, U-47 fired a single torpedo that sent the ship to the bottom. This was the first of many victories. Within that same week, the submarine found more success. On September 6th, they spotted a ship called the Rio Dorado. On the next day, they sank another called the Gartavon. These early successes proved that the design of the boat was effective and that Prien was a capable leader. The crew was quickly becoming comfortable with the terrifying reality of life at sea. They were learning how to stalk their prey and how to vanish back into the waves before help could arrive. Over the course of its career, U-47 would become a symbol of the submarine war. It was credited with sinking 31 enemy merchant ships, totaling over 160,000 tons of cargo. This made it one of the most successful boats in the fleet. These missions were not easy. The boat had to navigate through heavy storms and avoid the growing number of British escort ships. These escort ships were equipped with underwater detection sonar, which used sound waves to find submarines hiding beneath the surface. Each time U-47 attacked, it had to quickly dive deep and remain silent for hours to avoid being destroyed by depth charges. Despite these successes in the open ocean, the commander was looking for a bigger challenge. He wanted to take the fight directly to the heart of the enemy's strength. The early patrols proved the boat and crew were ready. Now, we look at the specific mission that would test them beyond anything they had faced before. The night of October 13, 1939, would become the most famous moment in the history of U-47. The submarine arrived at the eastern entrance of Scapa Flow, the main base for the British Royal Navy. This harbor was a giant natural bowl of water surrounded by islands, and the British believed it was safe from any underwater attack. Commander Prien decided to enter through a very narrow channel called Kirk Sound. It was a risky move because the passage was shallow and filled with old sunken ships placed there specifically to block intruders. The submarine stayed on the surface so Prien could see the obstacles. The sky was unusually bright due to the northern lights, which made the crew nervous. They were a dark silhouette against the water, making them an easy target if anyone was watching. Prien navigated the boat with incredible skill, moving past the rusted remains of the sunken ships. At one point, the submarine's hull actually scraped against a heavy anchor chain, but the boat kept moving. Against all odds, they had broken into the heart of the British fleet's home. Once inside the massive harbor, the crew began searching for targets. To their disappointment, the main part of the British fleet was not there. However, they soon spotted a massive shape looming in the darkness. It was the HMS Royal Oak, a giant battleship from the First World War. It was a massive vessel, carrying hundreds of sailors and armed with enormous cannons. To the German crew, it was the perfect target. Prien ordered the first 3 torpedoes to be fired. Only one hit the front of the battleship, and the explosion was so small that the British sailors on board thought it was just an internal equipment failure. They did not even sound the alarm. This gave U-47 enough time to reload and turn around. At 1:16 in the morning, Prien fired 3 more torpedoes. This time, all 3 hit the side of the battleship with devastating force. The explosions tore through the thick steel of the ship, hitting the areas where the gunpowder was stored. A massive pillar of fire shot into the sky, and the battleship began to roll over. In just 15 minutes, the HMS Royal Oak sank to the bottom of the harbor. The base was now in a state of total panic. Searchlights began to scan the water, and patrol boats started dropping explosives. U-47 did not dive. Instead, Prien kept the boat on the surface and raced back out through the same narrow channel they had used to enter. By the time the British realized what had happened, the submarine was gone. This single night changed the course of the naval war and made the boat famous across the globe. But every run of good luck eventually meets a challenge that cannot be overcome. On the night of March 7, 1941, U-47 was south of Iceland, stalking a large group of merchant ships guarded by fast escorts. The sea was brutal. Waves slammed the boat. Freezing spray reduced the sight of lookouts, and every second on the surface felt like a gamble. But Prien pressed the attack anyway, because in weather like this the escorts could lose you. Or you could lose them. U-47 edged closer in the darkness, trying to hold position in the chaos. The convoy was there, but it was never still. Ships rose and fell like black cliffs. Escort vessels cut across the gaps, hunting shapes in the storm. Somewhere out in that noise, the line between hunter and hunted could vanish in a heartbeat. And then U-47 went silent. For decades, many believed a British escort, HMS Wolverine, found U-47 with sonar, an underwater listening system, and destroyed it with depth charges. The crew reported a strong contact, a hard attack run, and then signs that looked convincing. A flash, followed by oil and debris on the surface. It sounded like a clean ending. But when historians later compared reports and positions more closely, the evidence pointed to a disturbing possibility. Wolverine likely attacked a different German submarine. That leaves U-47's final minutes as a mystery. A torpedo could have circled back if its steering failed. A mine could have been drifting in the same dark water. Or a mechanical failure could have turned the ocean into a steel trap. One crack in the hull, and the pressure at depth would do the rest. Whatever happened, the outcome never changed. U-47 vanished with no survivors, no final radio message, no wreck, no confirmed grave. One of the war's most famous submarines simply disappeared into the North Atlantic, and the sea kept the answer. This disappearance hit Germany hard. But even without a wreck to point to, the legend did not sink with the boat. Its story shaped how both sides understood submarine war and what it cost. The legacy of U-47 is more than just a list of ships it destroyed. Its actions changed the way the war at sea was fought and forced both sides to rethink their strategies. When the news broke that a German submarine had entered Scapa Flow and escaped, It shocked the British government. They had always assumed their main naval base was a fortress. After the attack, the British were forced to spend a huge amount of money and effort strengthening their defenses. They sank more blockships and eventually built permanent stone walls, known as the Churchill barriers, to completely close off the channels where U-47 had entered. This changed the geography of the islands forever. In Germany, the success of U-47 was used to build massive public support for the war. Commander Prien was treated like a modern hero, and his return was celebrated with parades. This was the first time a submarine crew received such intense public attention. The government used this fame to convince thousands of young men to join the submarine service. They wanted to show that the Navy could strike back against a much larger power. However, this fame also had a downside. When the boat eventually disappeared, the German leaders kept it a secret for as long as possible because they feared the news would hurt the country's morale. On a technical level, U-47 proved that the Type 7 design was incredibly effective. Because of the success of this specific boat, the German Navy decided to make the Type 7 the workhorse of their fleet. It became the most produced submarine design in history. Engineers looked at the performance of U-47 to make small but important improvements to the hundreds of boats that followed it. The balance of speed, how deep it could go, and its firepower became the standard for the rest of the conflict. Today, U-47 is remembered as one of the most famous vessels of the Second World War. It represents a time when a single vessel could change the course of naval history through surprise and planning. Historians still study the raid on Scapa Flow as a classic example of a daring mission. The snorting bull logo that Prien chose for his boat became a famous symbol for his entire submarine group, and it is still recognized by history enthusiasts today. The story of the boat survives in books, films, and museums around the world. It serves as a reminder of the intense and often invisible war that took place beneath the ocean waves. But as we reflect on these events, it is important to think about how these stories continue to reach new people today. The story of U-47 is a powerful reminder of how intense the war beneath the waves really was, from the daring raid on Scapa Flow to the submarine's mysterious disappearance in the North Atlantic. Now, we want to hear from you. Was Scapa Flow mostly luck, or the result of pure skill? And what do you think happened to U-47 in its final hours? Share your theory in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the boat's technology and combat history, please hit like. It helps us keep making documentaries like this. For more World War II naval stories, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story from the past.